Just wanted to do a quick heads up on this episode. Unfortunately, we weren't able to release this anytime during Pride Month. During Pride Month, there was a huge change, both in my personal life and professional life, some good and bad, but just wanted to go ahead and put this out there that I'm sorry that a lot of episodes that we've recorded lately have not gone out on time, but we will be releasing those during this week and next week. Up first is an episode that we recorded with Aron Johnson, who is part of Equality NC and a good friend of ours. And I apologize to him profusely that this episode did not go out on time because I had a lot of fun talking to him. And in the meantime, thank you for listening. I hope you enjoy this episode, and we'll see you later. Today on the Left of Old North, we are joined by someone who lives and breathes community power and is on the front lines of the fight for LGBTQ+ rights in North Carolina. Aron Johnson is the organizing director for Equality NC, and where he works to build sustainable grassroots infrastructure across the state, especially in queer and marginalized communities that are too often ignored by those in power. As a proud North Carolinian, Aron is the first in his family to graduate from college, earning his degree from Edgecombe Community College and UNC Greensboro. And he brings more than a decade of experience leading and managing diverse teams across local, state, and federal campaigns. And he's someone who deeply understands that liberation isn't given, it's built. So in this conversation, we're going to talk about the role of organizing during Pride Month, what it means to protect LGBTQ+ North Carolinians in a hostile political climate, and how we all can do more to show up, not just in June, not just in Pride Month, but every single day. Aron, welcome to the show.
Thanks for having me.
Yeah. We've run into each other a couple times in our various escapades. I know that you and CJ have probably known each other a little bit longer, or at least been in the same spaces a little bit longer. So you've been organizing, though, for over a decade. What was the first issue or campaign that really lit the fire for you?
Sure. So my first campaign was in 2014. I was an intern for Kay Hagan's re-election campaign to the U.S. Senate. And the story I always like to tell folks about that one is I actually got involved because of my mom. She lost her job in '08 when the economy got incredibly bad. And I remember her coming home the day that she lost her job, kind of down, talking about how things are going to be a little bit harder. And then from there was kind of like a light bulb that went off for her, that voting was going to be an action that you take to elect people who are going to go to Washington and make sure that our local economy isn't going to be suffering like it was in '08. So fast forward 6 years, when I was a senior in high school, when I had the ability to get involved in my own community and take some change, signed up through a random email that I had gotten. I don't really know to this day how they got my email address, but nonetheless.
We never do. We never know how they get it.
Evergreen. And a decade later, now I work in this industry, and I still have no idea how my email addresses ended up on any of those lists. I signed up to go and knock doors, and we met at my county library. I'm from Nash County originally. I ended up meeting folks at the Braswell Library, where I went to go knock doors kind of towards downtown in Rocky Mount, where I met voters who, like my mom, had been down and out since the '08 recession and needed folks in Washington to stand up and fight for them. And it was at that moment that I realized that Democrats were the folks doing that. That light bulb kind of clicked. My candidate, my boss at that point, Kay Hagan, had done a really good job in Washington bringing representation to North Carolina. And since 2014, every campaign I've worked on, every cause I've worked on, I try to imagine from that same space who's going to go and actually build power to fight for communities like mine who will build the types of representation or serve as a type of representation that serve folks like my mom and communities like I grew up in. And yeah, I know that's a long answer to your question, but Kay Hagan in 2014 was the first race I was a part of.
No, that's cool. And so your upbringing and education pretty much directly shaped your approach to how you engage in movements, how you organize. At least that's what it sounds like.
Absolutely. Like you mentioned in the intro, I was the first in my family to go to college, first in my family to graduate from college. And I did so by my mom, who was still really dealing with the aftermath of that '08 recession. That type of being able to go to college and not really have that type of, context as to like how to navigate complicated systems, how to with like the actual physical being on a campus for the first time outside of my hometown. Really just taught me a lot about how to roll up my sleeves and really just try to run through as many of these walls as we can. But yeah, I would argue that like it did have certainly an impact on how I grew up. And sorry, reset had an impact on the kind of work that I do.
Well, so speaking of like the work that you do, what are you up to now here in present day?
Sure. I'm the organizing director at Equality North Carolina, which has been around in North Carolina since 1979. We're the oldest LGBTQ plus nonprofit in the country, and in North Carolina, taken a couple of different identities. We rebranded Equality North Carolina in the 80s. The first PAC supporting LGBTQ plus rights started in the 90s here in North Carolina, and the current version of Equality that folks recognized started in 2002, where the Equality North Carolina Foundation at that point and the Pride PAC merged to just form Equality North Carolina, which still works to hold our legislators accountable today and to elect champions for equality in the elections across the state.
So in doing that, right, in holding elected officials accountable, especially across North Carolina, what are you doing? Especially during this political moment, people hear PAC, right, and they think, oh, it's just a way to funnel money and stuff like that. But how are you putting the action in political action committee?
That's a good question. So I think it's important to note equality takes on a lot of different forms. We are a nonprofit. We are also a PAC in some other cases, which means that our work really does go year round, right? Our work isn't just about elections. Our work is about building sustainable change in communities across the state. So there's a couple of different ways we do that. One, we're training volunteers all the time to use their voices and to tell their stories. I'm a big believer that storytelling and organizing matters a lot. I think that if we are able to put a face on a lot of these different organizing efforts, the work becomes a little bit more sustainable and it helps make an impact long term. We're a nonprofit, we're a PAC, there's a lot of different things that go into it. The bottom line is that our work goes on year round. So year round, there's a couple of different priorities we're focusing on. One, training our volunteers to tell their stories. So building power through giving volunteers the tools to make sure they have ways to tell their stories, not just to their legislators in Raleigh, but to their local electeds on school boards. I know that recently there was an issue in Johnson County with the school board, to city councils across the state, to making sure that we're showing up at community events and making sure that folks have the physical tools and the skills needed to really equip themselves to have conversations that are going to build change long term. And then on top of that, we also do the accountability work. We work to get folks to the General Assembly to speak at committee hearings. We work to get folks at the General Assembly to pack the galleries. We work to recruit speakers who can go on the record and talk about why these bills are, and usually in most cases, bad. We don't get to pass the good stuff in North Carolina. We only get to pass the bad stuff or stop the bad stuff.
For now. Yeah,
for now, fingers crossed. Right. But essentially, there's a lot of work that we do to build power to make sure that our volunteers, one, have the tools they need to do to go and engage communities, and two, use those tools to hold electeds in their communities and in the General Assembly accountable.
It's quite a lot, to be honest.
Yeah.
A lot more than I thought it was going to be.
Yeah, agreed. With everything going on, especially right now in this moment of, let's just say, high political tension, to say the least, how, I guess, do you kind of go about building like momentum and trust and whatnot on these issues in, say, rural or politically hostile areas?
So as a queer guy myself from rural North Carolina, I can tell you that like there is a lot of like what folks would consider to be some form of tension there, right? But there's also a lot of support in these communities. I can tell you one of the speakers we had a hearing a couple of weeks ago at the General Assembly was someone who comes from Caswell County, identifies as trans, and spoke powerfully about how members of his community were able to support him at a time sometimes where state politics didn't necessarily feel as if they were being supportive. So certainly there's a lot of that, but I also think there's a lot of like support in communities, and at Equality what we're trying to do is harness as much of that as we possibly can. We'll talk more about this in a couple of seconds, but one of the ways we're going about doing that is identifying the different types of pride events happening across the state this year and making sure that we have a presence there. Tomorrow, we're filming this on a Friday, and tomorrow, of course, the first Saturday in June, which means there are Pride festivals happening across the state. Mm-hmm. Up to 5 events where Equality will have someone there. 3 of those 5 are happening in what could be considered rural communities. So we're going to be in Hendersonville at a Pride event. We're going to be in Pittsburgh. We're going to be in Wilson to make sure that we're not just necessarily connections and building power in those urban spaces. We're also building it in those rural spaces. Like I mentioned earlier, I'm a gay guy from rural North Carolina. And growing up, oftentimes I didn't necessarily think there were other folks like me that were in my community. There wasn't a lot of representation in media, in press, online of like what growing up in a rural space was as I was finding out more about myself. So equality is something that we're trying to be intentional about, is expanding and changing how we engage with these folks to make sure that one, folks have that sense of identity that they're seeing in some of these non-urban places, and two, the work that we do to build long-term power, so the build these networks, one, helps us long-term electorally. We're able to elect a bunch of good folks who are then able to make change in this local level to make rural life better. But two, we're also able to empower folks in communities that, again, historically speaking, folks haven't necessarily like paid that much attention to. And I do think that there's a lot of power in that, and I also think there's a lot of beauty in that.
Yeah, I like that. So there is a booth there that was there in 2024, I believe, and probably started in 2023, where it's a Christian extremist is probably the best way to put it, group that has a millstone that is painted like a rainbow and trans flag, and it has the Luke 7:12, I think, verse from it, which is basically insinuating that anybody who leads children astray should tie a millstone around their neck and be thrown into the sea. Now, not to broadcast too much, but I mean, like you said, this is being filmed prior to. So do you have any plans to address that?
Good question. I don't know if we have any specific plans to address that specifically, but that is something that we're aware of. Equality does a lot of work to also track a lot of what we're seeing with extremism across the state. We also have a lot of partner organizations that are responsible for tracking this as well. One, because we know that at heightened time, you mentioned the word tension earlier, in these tense times, there's a lot going on in the world, and we just want folks to make sure they have access to as much of that information as possible. And two, tracking this really does help us identify concerning trends and making sure that we're keeping folks safe and keeping communities safe. You know, while equality doesn't necessarily have a direct role in that last component, we do know that it's all kind of ties together. We are a part of like, I like to think about this as like an ecosystem, right? So equality is like one small part of a much larger ecosystem. Making sure that we are able to keep an eye on this as a part of that. And that means we're tracking and making sure that we are keeping an eye on it to make sure this doesn't transpire into like something else. And if we do have to take action in the future, certainly we'll figure out what that looks like, but certainly something that we're aware of.
Quick follow-up to that. What do you say to youths who are especially like feeling pretty froggy to get involved in the advocacy and organizing realm that may not like that answer, that it's like, okay, well, I know that you're not maybe directly doing anything about it in a way that some people might, probably with a little bit more intent behind it, but like, what would you say to those folks who it's like, okay, we have to remember that regardless of how these people feel, they are in our communities, and the aim is not to make the tensions rise even higher.
So I think that's why we approach our work with joy, with pride, pun not intended. There is a lot of work that we can do to really uplift positive moments in our community, right? Historically speaking, there really hasn't been a lot of attention paid to the positive, uplifting, again, prideful parts of this community. And at Equality and a number of other capacities, there's a lot that we can do to make sure that we're uplifting those folks and providing space for those things. The other thing that I'll mention, there is a lot of fear out there right now, right? That's a very real thing. But that's also because they want us to be scared. Like, folks want us to not engage with pride events. We don't want folks don't want us to engage with, speaking up at the General Assembly, at school board meetings across the state. Like, folks have gotten incredibly comfortable making sure that we are uncomfortable. And that's wrong. And I think that the best thing that we can do to make sure that we push back on that is not give them any space, right? Don't give them the ability to make sure folks feel uncomfortable in this very, very tense moment. Because that only makes it worse, right? Yeah. So speaking up and taking power and building power looks a lot more like uplifting those positive stories and making sure that folks know that, again, we have to get involved in this moment.
So I guess I know what I'm about to ask. It's probably can be both nuanced and also vague, let's say. But, when it comes to this type of advocacy, what winning, so to say, kind of look like to you, and how do you kind of perceive the path for getting there?
That is a good
question. I know vague and nuanced at the same time.
So I think a couple of things. I'll start with this. So one, we don't get to make as much progress in this yet as we want to, right? But there are still avenues to make that progress happen, even if it's incrementally and not necessarily in the sweeping ways that we want. So to answer your question, I think winning looks like, one, making sure that we continue to send folks to speak up at the General Assembly, making sure that we're making it harder for them to pass these bad bills. making sure that the avenues that we currently have to pass good bills are still protected, making sure that we're electing folks to city councils and to town councils and to school boards across the state to make sure that we're passing on a local level as many of these non-discrimination ordinances as we possibly can, making sure that stopping school boards from passing discriminatory policies against their queer students and their queer employees, making sure that we're working with as many private sector partners as we can to provide best practices, speaking up for folks that, hey, again, in their workplaces that may not have historically speaking had the ability to speak up or even know that speaking up is an option. So there is a lot of different tools we have in our toolkit to win. But I also think that, again, not surprising to anyone here, that winning incrementally is going to be more of a tactic versus the sweeping changes that we have. That requires a little bit more support in the General Assembly than we currently have, and hopefully we get steps closer election cycles in the future to changing that.
Yeah, and when it comes to like winning elections, I know that can be in a lot of different ways. Again, nuanced and maybe not a clean-cut answer, because there are some Democrats that will support gay people, but they won't necessarily pass legislation to help enforce or protect things for gay people. And then there are also Republicans who are either impartial about it or they are actually supportive of it. And so to you, is it more like we'll take what we can get, or is it we're seeking out specific people or specific causes that we want to support to make sure that the agenda that we want to pass in this state, which is, of course, protections for LGBTQ plus people in the interest of equality, which is right in the name, how does that look to you? Is it more of like we take what we can get, or we want to support certain people?
Good question. So I answer it this way. I think a couple of things. One, making sure that we have reset.
Well, I mean, I'll give you a
are-
couple examples too, if you
Sure.
want, like of specific people that I'm thinking of, like Democrats like Michael Ray, who was not exactly the most supportive for he look, we know you beat him. Good job, buddy. No. It's good though, right? Because like I said, it wasn't exactly in your best interest. Whether it was because he just was blasé about it or was actively advocating against it, Michael Ray did vote against protections for LGBTQ plus initiatives multiple times. And then on the flip side of that, we have somebody like Tricia Cotham, who turned coat on the Democrats and became a Republican, and yet still continues to support LGBTQ activities, and also, I mean, tries to bring people around to the trans issue within the NCGA. So those are just two examples for both you and for our listeners out there to know that North Carolina is like as wide as the state is, so is its spectrum.
It is a very wide spectrum. We're a big state, politically diverse, like ideologically diverse. There's a lot of different pieces of cattle we're trying to herd. So I'll say this. I think one, from an equality perspective, a large part of our work is holding members of the General Assembly accountable to the people that elected them. So in an ideal world, what that means is that we're building communities, we're building networks in places where we have these elected legislators who we aren't entirely sure how they're going to vote on these bills. And then working within their communities, working within their districts to really like lift up the concerns that we're seeing, making sure that their elected member is aware of these things. That said, that isn't necessarily always possible. We don't necessarily have a network in as many of these places as I would like. But what we do have is the ability to build that network. So we have the ability to go into these places to identify who are the folks there that we should be talking to, who are the members of the communities there that are doing the incredibly important work that might necessarily not be attached to any particular groups, and figuring out, again, how do we get these folks plugged into their General Assembly member to make sure that we stop them from taking some of these bad votes. That said, we also know that it isn't necessarily easy for some of these Democrats to vote the right way. I know that there are some Democrats that voted on a couple of bills that I'm not necessarily fond of their votes personally. Yeah, so I think two things. I think one, there is a lot of our work that is accountability work. And that is making sure that working with communities and places all across the state to hold their legislators accountable. So whether that's like the local PFLAG group that wants to stop their member taking some anti-trans votes, or working with like the local librarians to stop book bans. There's a lot of different parts of communities across the state that are already organizing, but at Equality, we just really want to tap in and figure out how to kind of like tie our work to what they're doing, or to tie all our goals together, right? Because like I mentioned earlier, we're an ecosystem, it all kind of comes together. The other part of this that I'll mention is that when it comes to the electoral perspectives of this, there are some members of the General Assembly that are in a bit of like a tougher spot, right? Voters in, let's say, I'll pick a county, my home county of Edgecombe County, voted for a member of the General Assembly, voted for a Democratic member of Congress, voted for a Democratic president. Relatively speaking, it's a safe seat. We know that Republicans are going to try to turn folks against each other. We know that they've already taken steps in our General Assembly, introduced bills that have forced Democrats into some compromising positions to vote individual communities. We don't need, as a caucus and as a party, I think it doesn't necessarily, and this is my personal hat, not necessarily the equality hat in this space.
Sure.
We don't win elections by tying ourselves to like that Republican narrative, right? We don't win elections working with them to, exclude members of communities. We don't build power otherizing trans kids. We don't win power working with them to ban books that tell our stories from public libraries that our taxpayer dollars provided, by the way. Yeah. So like there is some work that goes into making sure that a lot of these Democrats that are in these safer seats can and should take the right votes. That also said, we take nothing for granted. So talking to these folks and building conversations and earning their support for these things is something that goes into those considerations. And there are a lot of incredible partner organizations across the state that roll up their sleeves and have those same types of conversations. Because again, a lot of our rights and a lot of this work is tied to a lot of other rights Republicans in the General Assembly have communicated their interest in going after.
Well, I guess one thing I was kind of curious about, without, I guess, giving the game away, or, we're currently in June, so we got, call it a little under a year and a half until midterms 2026. In this organizing space, what does the next year and a half-ish look like for y'all as we're getting to that point, as we're getting closer to midterms?
I appreciate the way you asked that question, because I do think we still have some time before the elections next year. But the important thing to keep in mind is, one, because there is that time, there's plenty of runway that we have to build the actual systems and to build the plan needed to get champions of equality elected. So it looks like a couple of things. This year, we're focusing building as many different pots of supporters as we can all across the state. That means showing up at Pride events in as many places as we can, showing up to Pride events in places where we haven't historically. I mentioned the Pittsburghs and the Wilsons and the Henderson counties. Showing up, building our networks in these places, sustaining these relationships, so in getting these folks involved, tying them to different types of events that we can get them involved with, whether that be storytelling trainings, opportunities to speak at the General Assembly, or any other types of events that we host. And then next year, we'll mobilize those folks that we spent this year putting together. So that means that we are getting folks engaged closer to the elections next year. That means we're getting informed about who the candidates that we've chosen to endorse are. We've found ways to talk about different issues and identified ways to really hold and highlight the importance of these issues, so that way communities are aware their legislators and the people that they're electing will be focusing on those things. And I do think that next year the conditions are right to make some significant changes in our General Assembly. That said, the maps are still incredibly gerrymandered, and here in North Carolina, the odds are always against us. But I think what we're seeing from across the state is no matter where you are, folks are tired of seeing members of their communities and targeted, and they're electing and want to elect folks that are going to stand up for them and not necessarily tie them against each other. So this year and next year, that work to build these bases and then mobilize these bases does, one, it's already started, and then two, is going to just continue to get even more important.
What's your cookout order?
That's a damn good question. My cookout order actually reflects my priorities. So I'm from Eastern North Carolina, so I love Eastern Carolina barbecue. In my honest opinion, and it's not an opinion because I'm right, Eastern barbecue, it is the creme de la creme of barbecue. So I get a cookout, I get a barbecue sandwich. Usually there's the side of nuggets, maybe the hush puppies, depending on how we're feeling, maybe fries some days. I'm I'm also violently lactose intolerant, so I can't get the shakes, or else I would. And I'm very sad because this is the new development for me in my life. In high school and college, I love those shakes, and now I'm very sad I can't get them. So, great question.
The whole barbecue question, that might be what gets us canceled ultimately.
Yeah.
Well, I'll say this: Governor Hunt made a good point once at a breakfast or at the state party hosted. But I will say that Governor Hunt has like good taste in barbecue, and I'll say that every Democratic governor we've ever elected from this state has come from places where there's Eastern barbecue. We haven't elected a Western governor in over 100 years, and I think there might be a correlation between these two things.
That's well, the science is still out on that, but we'll need to do some peer reviews. So I'll pick up a Western barbecue sandwich and a Eastern barbecue sandwich from Cookout. Do a live taste testing.
You can also compromise and meet in the middle, and you can also do the Lexington style if you meet in the middle.
And I mean, I can definitely compromise because, like, no, I can't say my opinion yet. We can't do that yet. Anyway,
okay.
No,
I see where this is going.
A later episode.
I won't be.
But thank you, Aaron, for coming on today. It has been really great talking to you. We love the work that y'all are doing at Equality NC, and we hope to see much, much more of it in the coming years, especially like we were talking about with the run-up to 2026 and 2028. Where can people find you online to reach out if they have questions, and where can they reach Equality NC, and how can they get involved?
We have a website, equalitync.org, where folks can learn more about events we have coming up across the state, signing up to volunteer at a Pride booth somewhere across the state. Folks can also learn more about the specific policies that we're advocating for, and they can join our newsletter to learn a little bit more about other types of actions that we're taking. So that is equalitync.org. We're also on Instagram and Blue Sky and Facebook and any other platform that is not Twitter. So, or X, whatever we're calling it these days. So hope to see folks engaged, and looking forward to seeing folks across the state this month for Pride.
Awesome. Well, thank you so much.
Of course, thanks for having me.
Fantastic. And thank you so much for taking the time to join us and talk to us a little bit. The organization and your work, your personal background and everything.
Appreciate the work y'all are doing, and thank y'all for trying to change this media space, because we don't do enough of that.
Well, thank you for the work y'all are doing, and stay informed and stay in the fight, especially during Pride Month, but not only just during Pride Month, and that's the most important thing, right? So thank you for listening. Aaron, thanks for coming on, and stay with us on the Left of Old North.